I actually had a sixth grade teacher who told me that I was good at writing, and the idea must have stuck with me because by the time I was in junior high school, I applied to be on the yearbook staff, and I learned a little bit about writing and editing and even taking photographs. And then when I got to high school, I ended up being the co-editor of my high school newspaper. And I sometimes wonder if that just would have come and gone if we hadn't had a controversy at our high school. We had a computer that created our daily schedules, and it was a very controversial system because it worked for students who were good at discipline and planning and who applied themselves. It wasn't very good for students who didn't have that kind of discipline. So there was a series of school board meetings with angry parents, demonstrations by students on the campus, and I was covering this with my co-editor. And as a result, I ended up being in the company of professional journalists who were coming to our school. Lots of TV cameras, lots of reporters, including from the LA Times. That was our large hometown newspaper. So I really got a sense of how important it was to get correct information to people so that they could make up their own minds. And by the time I was looking at colleges, I thought I really wanted to explore that. But I was also interested in government. So I ended up going to Sacramento State University, where I started in the fall of 1977. And I had a double major called government journalism. And it was really pretty quickly that I discovered that journalism was where my heart was. I had an internship with a magazine called the California Journal. It was a magazine of state government and politics, nonpartisan, very heavily policy-oriented. They did do profiles of government figures, a couple of which I was able to write. One was on the new head of the state prison system, and that was in college. And it was a small staff. The editor was sort of a Lou Grant, gruff kind of guy. And I think he took a liking to me because I was so anxious to learn as much as I could. And he really did a lot to help shape my ideas about what I might be able to do professionally.
And did that kind of launch you into a professional world of journalism?
It did, because by the time I was in college, as part of my major, we were required to have an internship every semester. And the first internship I did was with the League of Women Voters. And one of my responsibilities was to hand out the press releases to the reporters in the building. That, they were there from all the different newspapers across the state, small, medium, large. And I would go office to office with my little press release. Most offices had a wire basket for press releases, and I'd put it in their basket. And one of the offices I was a regular visitor to was grandly called the Knight Ridder Newspaper Bureau. It was actually 2 reporters in a very small office, probably not much larger than my living room here. One reporter was Bob Schmidt, and he was with the Long Beach Press-Telegram, and Chuck Buxton was with the San Jose Mercury News. They were both owned by the Knight Ridder newspaper chain, and they covered state government and politics. So I got to know them, dropping off my little press releases. And at the end of my freshman year, they asked if I was coming back to school. I was. Did I need a job? I did. And so they took me on. And I was like a glorified secretary and librarian, really. I kept their files. I had to learn what issues they covered. And they got something like 12, 14 newspapers every day into their office. I would read through them. I'd look for stories on the issues that were of importance to them, cut them out, file them, and that was how I started. I do remember Bob saying, he was probably in his 50s at the time, I do remember him saying the one thing I would not have to do was make coffee, which was good because I didn't know how to make coffee. But little by little, they gave me new responsibilities. So they started sending me across the street to the Capitol building, and I do research on legislation for them. So I learned a lot about how the legislative process works, how the political process works. They would take me on interviews with them. I, of course, met the other reporters in the building who they associated with. And I remember one day, which was an ordinary day, I was clipping the newspapers. Both Bob and Chuck happened to be in the office at the time. And all of a sudden, the phone started ringing. I could hear them all over the floor. And what had happened was that Dan White, the San Francisco city councilman, had shot and killed the mayor of San Francisco, George Moscone. And I think the first openly gay city councilman, Harvey Milk. And it was just pandemonium. You know, all the reporters jumped up, ran across the street to the Capitol, wanting to get comments from the governor, who at the time was Jerry Brown, the first time he was governor. And that was a very exciting time to be in Sacramento. Jerry Brown was a former Jesuit. He had very unusual ideas about politics and about the role of a politician. And he was famous for having a Spartan apartment where there was just a mattress on the floor. And he was a very no-nonsense kind of guy, and he brought a lot of excitement and glamour to Sacramento, especially when he started dating Linda Ronstadt. But I remember all the reporters rushing across the street to try to get a comment from Jerry Brown. And that was the first time that I got to see a major news story in action and how the reporters were responding to it. So these experiences, I mean, when I think back on it, I was so lucky to have had them that young. Because when I started working for them, I would have been 19, I think. And I learned a lot just by observing how they did their jobs. And I was lucky that they took me and my interest in journalism seriously, and that they took the time to explain things to me, to teach me, to give me opportunities. Probably the last thing that they did for me was when they were going to have their annual interview with the governor, and they asked me if I would like to come along. And so we went across the street to the Capitol, the three of us, and they said I had one question I could ask. The rest of the time I had to sit there quietly. And so Jerry Brown attracted these characters around him, and when we got to the outside of his office, there were two gentlemen there. One was named Jacques Barzaghi, and he was this Frenchman, and he wore like a beret. He was a very eccentric sort of fellow. And then there was a gentleman, very tall, B.T. Collins. He was hard to miss. He had a mechanical, not a mechanical arm, but it's not a prosthesis like you see people wearing today. It was a much more primitive. You know, he'd been in Vietnam. And these two men were real characters. And they started chatting with us, and when they found out that I was going to be going in for the interview, they were very interested in that. And I just remember feeling very, grown up and part of the group. So we go into the office, but no one apparently had warned Jerry Brown that I was coming in. So we go into the office, and I could see he was perplexed, and he just kept looking at me, like, what is she doing here? But once we sat down, and Bob and Chuck started asking their questions, and he could see, Jerry Brown could see I was taking notes also. At some point, Bob or Chuck indicated to me I could ask my question. I wish I could remember what it was. And Jerry Brown answered it very seriously. I was so surprised. But he responded to me like he was talking to Bob or Chuck, like I was a professional journalist.
Did you see many other women reporters at that time?
There were a handful. Bob Schmidt with the Long Beach Press-Telegram was married to a woman from the AP, Jennifer Kerr, I think was her name. Maybe one or two others. but not at that level. So the way newspapers worked at that time was that you really worked your way up. You started out as a cub reporter. You covered local, your local police department, criminal courts perhaps, or civil courts, or city hall. If you were lucky, you were promoted to cover state politics. You need to go to your newspaper's state bureau in Sacramento. And if you were really lucky, you would be promoted to your Washington bureau and you'd go to Washington, D.C. It was a long process and there was a lot of competition. So at that point, late 70s, the women's movement was still, the women's movement of the late 20th century was still pretty new. And you could see some changes starting to come, but I was really part of a generation that was only just starting to benefit from those changes. So I didn't see too many women at that level. Later, when I took my first job at the San Jose Mercury News, there were a lot more women there, but they were also very active and trying to make sure that they were promoted, that they got the good assignments, and it caused some friction because the men in the newsroom weren't used to that. Certainly not the management.
So how did you progress in your career from internship with Bob and Chuck?
One day I was clipping the newspapers and I saw a very small news story about applications being taken for a program at UC Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley. And it was called the Summer Program for Minority Journalists. And I didn't know from the story too much about the program, but something caught my eye, and that was this. If you were selected, and they were only taking about 19 people, if you were selected, they would, after a summer of instruction, arrange it so that you could have a full-time newspaper job for 1 year. And I was getting close to, I was like, less than a year from graduating from college. I needed a job. And I had already started looking for a job. And then as now, it's hard to find your first job. People are looking for experience that you really haven't had the time to get yet. And I saw this and I thought, wow, this would be ideal. And so I asked Bob and Chuck what they thought. And I remember Bob saying to me, he said, everybody in life has an advantage of some kind. You have to figure out what yours is and make the most of it. And he said, and it will only get you so far, and then you have to take it the rest of the way. And he said, they're looking for people like you. You're serious about wanting to be a journalist. We can see that. We'll write you letters of recommendation. We'll do anything we can to help you. I think Bob knew the dean at UC Berkeley, for one, of the journalism school. So I applied, and that was one of those things in life that you do when you're young where you don't really understand the parameters of things, and maybe if you did, you'd be too intimidated to actually go through with it. So I applied, and I had by that time also done a summer internship at the Long Beach Press-Telegram, which had been arranged by Bob Schmidt. And I'd worked in their library, and I'd also worked on their consumer column called Action Line. So I had clips, what we call in newspapers, clips, examples of my writing. And initially I didn't have my name on the clips, but after a month or so, they gave me my first byline. And so I had some professional clips to show. I had letters of reference from Bob and Chuck, from the editor, the metropolitan editor or the city editor at the Long Beach Press-Telegram, from the editor Ed Salzman of the California Journal. So I felt I had a pretty good application. And I received a notice that I had made the semifinals, and now it was time to go for an interview. Well, I didn't have a car. Sacramento is, 90 minutes maybe from Berkeley. So I took a Greyhound bus to Berkeley, and I showed up at the room for the interview, and there were all these other people lined up outside. They had portfolios with them, and they seemed just to be better prepared than I felt once I saw them. And when I went in the room, it was one of those situations where they had a long rectangular table and people on both sides of it. And there were good cops and bad cops. So there were people who I could tell were asking me the softball questions, and then there were people with the hard questions. And it was about an hour-long interview. And I was looking around the room, and I began to realize that those people were they were going to be the instructors in the program. They were from the reporters from the Washington Post, from the Wall Street Journal, from the New York Times, from the LA Times, the San Francisco Chronicle. And I think at that point, I thought just to go for broke. I felt way in over my head, but I did my best to look confident and sound confident. But when I walked out the door, I thought to myself, okay, you have to figure out plan B. You're not going to get this. It was just too intimidating. And what I learned later is that all of these people had covered the civil rights movement. And they had quickly realized that most of the reporters were white men. And there were areas of cities where reporters were not welcome by the residents because they would see a white man who looked nothing like them, didn't know anything about their lives, couldn't relate to them. And this group of journalists who were friends, all at the highest levels of journalism at the time, decided they were going to do something about it, that there wasn't time to wait for people to go through journalism school and to make their way through the usual processes that I described earlier. They needed to jumpstart the process. They needed to shoot people directly into metropolitan newsrooms and get them going. And they were looking for people who they thought were going to make it anyway. And again, I didn't think they were going to pick me, but they did. And so I graduated from college in May of 1981, and a few weeks later I was at UC Berkeley. And this program was run like a boot camp. It was around the clock. We had our first class at 7 in the morning. By then we'd had to have read 4 or 5 newspapers that we were quizzed on. And then we put out a weekly newspaper called Deadline. We were given assignments. We were edited mercilessly. There was one reporter who'd been at the New York Times. I remember one of his claims to fame is he had interviewed John Lennon. At any rate, his name was Leroy Aarons, and he later came out as gay, one of the first journalists at that level to do so. And we called him the Silver Slasher. He had gray hair. And you never got a story back that you had written that wasn't marked all up in red. And sometimes I think about that when I do editing now for young people, and I can see they're crestfallen when I give them my edits. And I think to myself, you've not seen anything. Just a quick aside, later when I was a reporter in the Newhouse Newspaper's Washington Bureau, I was covering a beat called Gender and Sexuality. I'd written a story exposing the fallacy of statistics that purported to show that gay teenagers were more susceptible to suicide than straight teenagers. And it was a statistic widely quoted then and still is widely quoted now, but it's not based in any fact at all. So Leroy, who was then teaching journalism at USC, invited me to come speak to his class. And, excuse me, in true to form, he was really tough on me. When I made my presentation, he questioned my sources, he questioned my process, and he encouraged the students to do the same. And it was really a vigorous conversation. And afterwards, he told the students, he said, I believe in my heart of hearts that this is true just because I know what my own personal experience was. And he said, but Delia's a good reporter, and I trust her reporting, and she's done a good job defending it. Wow, I think about that now, and coming from him, it's meant so much that he thought I became a good reporter. So, but that group of people, they were so hard on us. We had our assignments during the day. We covered city council and county supervisor meetings at night. We had to write our stories when we got back to our dorm rooms. We had to turn them in when we showed up for class at 7 a.m. And we didn't sleep that summer at all. But it was so much fun, and I learned a lot about just how to comport myself. One of the instructors, Nancy Hicks, who was the first African-American woman hired by the New York Times and the youngest, I think she was hired at the age of 22, she bothered herself to talk to us about how we dressed, and we were expected to dress professionally during the program. And that was something that I noticed when I did start working professionally, that a lot of young reporters didn't know that, and it impacted how seriously they were taken by management. And I learned if you have to dress the part that you want to be perceived as. So they bothered themselves, with the details in addition to trying to train us to be good journalists.
And what was your placement after the end of that program?
So, again, in my ignorance, I thought that I might have some influence over where I was going to go, but that's not how it worked. The program, I didn't realize how much time and effort they spent talking with the editors and publishers of newspapers around the country to convince them to take one of their students. So the deal was you would go for 1 year. You were obligated for 1 year, the newspaper was obligated for 1 year. If either of you at the end of 1 year decided it wasn't working out, that was it, no hard feelings. And I thought it would be swell to go to the Los Angeles Times, and said so. And Nancy Hicks took me aside and she said, listen, you're not going to the LA Times. She said, we have been trying for some time to get the San Jose Mercury News to take somebody from the program. I've just had lunch with the publisher. They have finally agreed to do so. You are our guinea pig. You cannot fail there. You have to go there and you have to succeed. Because if you succeed, then you will open the door for other people. And she said, so get it out of your head that you're going to the LA Times, because you're not. So I didn't know anything about San Jose. It's a mid-sized city in the middle of the state in the Bay Area. Much, much, much overshadowed by San Francisco. That was the glamorous city to be in. But what I did not know was that the San Jose Mercury News is from this small, sleepy city, had come under the radar of night reader newspapers. Silicon Valley was just starting to emerge. There was a tech revolution that was just taking hold. And night reader newspapers realized they had a newspaper right in the middle of it. And they poured money and people into it. And they scoured the country looking for the most talented reporters, editors, photographers, graphic artists. And I was lucky enough to go to that newspaper at that moment. And there was so much energy, so many young people, so much encouragement, so much enthusiasm, so many opportunities to really learn how to be a good journalist and to do really fascinating stories. And I couldn't have landed in a better place. And however, when I arrived, they didn't know what to do with me. They didn't really understand what the program was. They didn't really understand what my skills were. For the first week I was at the newspaper, I was sat at a desk, seated next to the editors. I had no typewriter. Word processors were very brand new. We were one of the first newspapers to have them. I didn't have that either. I didn't have a telephone. And I just really didn't know what to do. I was assigned an editor, so I was 22. My editor was, I think, 27, 28, educated at Harvard, very smart guy, Mark Saylor, chess player. He didn't know what to do with me either. So as a result, he didn't do anything. And a few days into my first week, this very handsome, tall man approached me, who I soon found out was named Jack Sirica. His father was Judge Sirica of Watergate fame. Jack had recently come from the Washington Star, which had folded. And he was considered a star, even before he arrived. A beautiful writer, a beautiful reporter, very handsome. And he came over and he introduced himself to me. And he said, "What are you doing sitting over here?" And I said, "Well, that's where they told me to sit." And he said, "Yeah, well, come with me." And he sat me at the desk across from him. It had a typewriter, it had a word processor, and it had a phone. And then I started getting assignments. My editor walked up to me and figured, okay, well, I had the tools, and started giving me assignments. So and Jack and I are friends to this day. He's now 71, I think, and I'm 65 now. So we've known each other our entire adult lives.
What sort of things did you start out covering?
I was a general assignment reporter at first, which meant everything. I did fires, I did police calls, weather stories. Weather stories became a specialty of mine, not because I wanted them, but because I was such a young reporter. And the editors at the newspaper, by and large, came from the East Coast, and they were used to weather being an issue and a story. In California, it's not a story. It's always the same. But you had to figure out some way to write about the weather. So my specialty was a weather story, 12 inches with art, meaning a story about this long with a photograph about this big. And they'd put it on the front of the local news section. And I would usually work with a photographer, and the photographers too. They were trying to figure out some new way of showing what the weather was, you know. So say it was a warm day, so we might go to a water park, and they'd take pictures of children, and I would interview, you know, the parents or something. You know, I was just looking for something to make it slightly different. The best weather story that I ever saw written was by a reporter named Miles Corwin, who later went to the Los Angeles Times. He was a very gifted reporter, writer. And when it happened to rain one day, he was sent out to do the weather story. So he went down to downtown San Jose, where the prostitutes hung out. And he interviewed the prostitutes and how the rain impacted their business. Now that was creative. The nice thing about being a newspaper reporter is that reading the newspaper is part of your job. So I would arrive at the office in the morning and read the newspaper from, you know, front to end with my coffee. Usually about 11 or so, I would get an assignment for the day. There'd be a morning meeting of the editors, and they'd figure out, you know, what it was they want covered that day. It wasn't until later that I started to come up with my own story ideas. I didn't really understand how to come up with my own ideas initially. It took a little while to learn. But when I did reach that stage, I would pitch my editor, and he would, you know, say yes or no, and off I would go. One of the reasons I was attracted to journalism was that I didn't want to be in an office all day long. And that was the best part of my job. I spent very little time in the building itself. I would be out in the city. So I was meeting people. I was discovering things. I was discovering a lot about the people who lived there, how they lived their lives, what they were doing, what was interesting about that. And I would bring this back to the newsroom, lots of conversations with my editor. I remember pretty early on, he said that he liked working with me because I soaked up everything like a sponge. And that's how I felt in those really, you know, couple of early years. By the time I was in my mid-20s, I'd been a general assignment reporter for like 3 years, I guess, at that point. And I was doing okay. Nothing really extraordinary, or I was still learning the ropes, I would say. But in my mid-20s, the Metropolitan editor approached me and asked if I'd be interested in covering criminal courts. The criminal courts reporter was switching to a new beat. And I was really surprised that he asked me to do this, because it was considered one of the showboat beats at the newspaper. It was a way to really make a name for yourself. And the Metro editor, Pat Dillon, had been in Vietnam. He'd been in combat. He'd led a platoon. I think he was a captain. He cut quite a figure in the newsroom. Very handsome man. He was probably in his mid-30s at the time. And I think back on it now. That environment I was in that newsroom is very much a product of the time. So I'm a baby boomer, born at the end of the baby boom, 1959. The people I knew in the newsroom, it was, there were World War II veterans in that newsroom. There were people who had been in Vietnam in that newsroom. The managing editor had worked for Stars and Stripes in I think, Saigon during the war. There were people with really very interesting life experiences. There were women who were starting to take advantage of the changes being brought by the women's movement. There was a lot socially happening in there. And plus, I myself was part of an effort to try to diversify the newsroom. I didn't think of myself that way exactly. But when I look back at the group of people who were in that newsroom, I see that there was someone as privileged as Jack Sirica, who came from sort of the powerful circles of Washington, D.C., and then there was someone, like me. I'd grown up in Southern California. My father was a longshoreman. My mother worked in the school district, worked in the attendance office at a high school and at a junior high school. And they had not gone to college. My mother had gone to junior college. And I don't remember them pushing us or telling us we had to go to college or even telling us that we had to do our homework. We somehow, my sisters, two sisters and I, we just absorbed that as being expected and normal and natural. And we expected that we were going to go to college. And my youngest sister ended up at a prep school in high school. She competed in a academic test and placed high enough that part of her tuition was paid for. She ended up at Princeton University. My sister Linda went to Bryn Mawr. So just like in one generation, we were meeting people and being exposed to situations that we had not been a part of, as in our growing up years. So, but I think back to that newsroom in San Jose, and I was comfortable with all of those people. And I learned from all of those people. So Patrick Dillon, Vietnam War veteran, asked me if I wanted to cover criminal court. So of course I said yes. And that was really, I think, when I began to really understand what it meant to be a newspaper reporter. I was literally covering life and death issues. And I was covering murder trials. I was covering corruption cases. I on one occasion was covering the case of a guy who was a leader in the Mexican mafia. And he was a bit like Al Capone. They could only kind of get him on charges kind of on the edge. They could never quite get what he was really doing. But they were trying to keep him out of circulation by getting him on the smaller charges. And there was a trial in one of his cases that I was covering. And I was trying to get the DA, the district attorney who's handling the case. The actual district attorney was handling the case because it was considered so important. And I was trying to get an interview with him, and he wouldn't talk to me. And but I did get an interview with the Mexican mafia guy. And when the story appeared in the paper, the first person to call that morning was the district attorney asking me to come to his office. He said he was ready to talk. And so it was my day. Yes, what were my days like? So really, at that point, anything could happen. Very unpredictable. There was another day when, again, a normal sort of work day, and I happened to be in the newsroom, and over the police radio came a call that a police officer had been shot. And they gave the address. It was in downtown San Jose. A lot of the editors at the time weren't as interested in living in San Jose. It wasn't seen as cool. They wanted to live in Palo Alto or further up the peninsula or in San Francisco. So a lot of the editors didn't actually really know their way around San Jose very, very well. But at that point, I was living in downtown San Jose. I was living in a building called the Barcelona Apartments that had been built in the 20s. Maybe had 20 apartments in it. Really wonderful building. So I knew my way around town, and I heard the address, and I knew exactly where it was. And I yelled out to my editor, "I know where that is." And I just started running out of the newsroom and got my car and drove down to where the shooting was. And when I arrived, they'd already, the other cops who had arrived had managed to shoot and kill the man who had shot the police officer. It was at a donut shop of all things. And this man who shot the police officer he was mentally ill. And he somehow got the cop's gun out of his holster, just came up from behind him, got it and shot him. The cop didn't have a chance. And by the time I arrived, the shooter was dead and the police officer had been taken to the nearest hospital. So I knew where that was. So I headed over to the hospital, and I walked into the lobby, and I saw the mayor and the police chief in a hallway huddled together, and they looked very distraught. And I walked up to them, and I knew both of them. The mayor, in fact, lived right on the other side of the alley from my apartment building. And because I covered courts and cops, I knew the police chief. And I asked them, what the officer's condition was, and they said it didn't look good at all. And so I waited with them, and that was the benefit of working in a smaller market, at that time, because you got to know the people who were in charge, and they were comfortable with you, hopefully. So I waited until the surgeon came out, and the police officer had died on the table. And then he started to explain to the police chief and to the mayor what he had done to try to save the police officer. And I realized that was the story, And so I asked the surgeon if we could go to the cafeteria, because I wanted to get down this sort of like a chronicle of what had happened from the moment the officer had arrived at the hospital. And so that was the story I wrote. And they put it on the front page. And it was there was a lot going on just in that one story. It's not that shootings and murders were unusual in San Jose, because it was a big city. But it was a police officer, and police shootings are always big news. And it had really, there had been an all-out effort to save this officer's life, and they just weren't able to do it. But how they went about it was really, what we would have called a good human interest story. It was a way to get to know that person, that officer, so that he just wasn't a name.
What other stories stand out to you from your time working in San Jose?
Well, I would say that the culmination, really, of the 9 years I spent in San Jose was the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. So I had mentioned earlier that all of these people had sort of coalesced, in this one newsroom. People who went on to have storied journalism careers, winners of Pulitzer Prizes, and people became editors at other newspapers. And but for the 9 years that I was there, I felt like, and I think other people in the newsroom felt like, we didn't quite get the respect we were due, that we did really good work. And then in October of 1989, October 17th to be exact, I was sitting at my desk in the newsroom. I was a little bit bored. I was writing a, non-essential story that was going to run in the local section of the newspaper the next day. And I was kind of dragging my feet writing it. It wasn't that exciting to me. And then the earthquake hit. And in that moment, everything changed, It's like all of the work and effort that the people at that newspaper had been doing for the past 10 years, just all of a sudden, everybody went into autopilot. Everybody did like the thing that they were trying to do. And it was a huge story. It happened during the third game. I think it was the third game of the Bay Bridge series, as it was called. It was the San Francisco Giants and the Oakland A's. So there was already a lot of attention on the Bay Area. People around the country were watching live on television when the earthquake hit, waiting for the game to start. And you had all the, thousands of people in the stadium waiting for the World Series game to start. And because of the our location, the technology the newspaper had, and so forth, we were able to publish. The San Francisco Chronicle, if I'm remembering correctly, was not initially able to publish. And this was the week that I learned how important journalism was and what its purpose was. I loved learning. I loved meeting the people I was meeting. I don't know that I was really thinking up until then I don't know that I was as conscious of journalism as a public service. But when the earthquake came, I really understood that. I understood how important information was for people, how it could be life and death, important. And I felt like everything that we had been working for in that 10 years came to fruition on that day and in the weeks following. I myself was sitting at my desk, and the shaking in the building was so violent that I could not focus on the concrete pillars in the newsroom. And I remember seeing flashes of color, which I later realized were people trying to run out of the building. And people were apparently yelling at me to get under my desk, but I couldn't hear them. There's that cliche of when you hear like a tornado coming or an earthquake that it sounded like a freight train. It did sound like a freight train. I couldn't hear anything. And as soon as the shaking stopped, everybody sort of made sure that, we were okay. Then the editors started, shouting across the newsroom, telling people to go different directions to try to figure out what was happening, what was going on. And as I was running out of the newsroom, I was sent to this little community called Morgan Hill. They had heard that there was severe damage there. I remembered somebody saying that the Bay Bridge was down. And I remember thinking, that's impossible. That can't be. And in fact, a portion of the Bay Bridge had collapsed. And I just remember everything that we heard that day. It just seemed like impossible, but it was happening. And the days after the quake are a bit of a blur, but we were all assigned to do different things. So one day I was doing rewrite, which meant that I was sitting at my desk, reporters were calling in to me, and then I was writing the story. And the story at that point had shifted from San Francisco, where there were fires in the Marina district and a lot of collapsed homes, to the Santa Cruz, the city of Santa Cruz and the Santa Cruz Mountains. And we had a reporter there, and we were expecting him to come back into the newsroom, and my phone rang, and it was a woman who asked, who said to me, I understand that you you've been to Santa Cruz and you can tell us what's happening there. And I said, well, no, I haven't, but the reporter who has is on his way in. And I was going to take her name, and she said, well, can he talk to Ted? And I'm thinking, who's Ted? And who she meant was Ted Koppel with Nightline. And cable news wasn't a thing yet. And Ted Koppel's Nightline was one of the most popular nightly news programs of the time, if not the most popular nightly news program of the time. And just at that moment, I saw the reporter come in the door. And so I motioned for him to come over to talk to this woman. And he ended up on Nightline that night, explaining what he had seen. We had people everywhere, people in San Francisco, people in Oakland, the Santa Cruz Mountains. And there were a handful of reporters and writers whose work was submitted for a Pulitzer Prize for our coverage. That's how they do the judging. They can't take all of the coverage, obviously. So they selected what they felt was the best of the coverage and submitted it for a Pulitzer Prize. And the staff was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. It was a staff award, even though there was a group of reporters whose work was the focus of it. And the executive editor and the publisher of the paper felt so much that it was such a communal effort that they had duplicates made of the certificate for every member of the staff. So I have my duplicate copy of the award, and that meant so much to me. I left the newspaper soon thereafter to go to the Dallas Morning News. But I had grown up at that newspaper. I'd been 22 when I arrived. It was almost like a second home in a way. And sometimes I say I was raised by wolves. What I mean by that is that a newsroom is like no other place. Very irreverent, lots of characters, very colorful, lots of profanity. At that time, a lot of drinking and smoking. It takes a certain personality to not only enjoy that environment, but to thrive in it. And when I left there, I felt like I was a grown-up. I felt like a veteran journalist at that point when I left. The benefit of having grown up there was also the downside. I had grown up there. So at some point, I felt that the editors could not see beyond what I had been. I felt it was really difficult for me to make the next transition in my career. And I felt I had to leave there, just in the way you have to leave home. When you're 18 or so, it's time to go. And it was time for me to go. And it was a hard thing to do because I really loved it there. But an editor I had known in San Jose was the new features editor at the Dallas Morning News. And they were expanding their staff. And she called me and asked if I'd be interested in coming to talk to her about a job. And at the time, to be honest, I thought, well, maybe if I go and talk with them, and maybe if I get a job offer, I can parlay that into a better, position at this newspaper or at another newspaper. And I was still thinking of the LA Times. I was still thinking that was my goal. I had gone there in 6th grade on a field trip, and I still remember they gave us the little lead pieces that they would, print the newspaper with. And I just loved that newspaper. There was a big, huge globe in the lobby. It was very much like Clark Kent in the Daily Planet. And I could see myself there. So I was still thinking of this. So I went to Dallas, and Dallas was a lot like Los Angeles. You had to know, they're really interesting neighborhoods and parts of the city, but you had to know where they were. Otherwise, it could just seem like this big, sprawling place. So it felt familiar to me that way. The Dallas Morning News was in the process of winning its newspaper war against the afternoon paper, the Times-Herald, which they eventually did within the year, which meant that they were starting to throw a lot of money into the paper. Again, they were doing what the San Jose Mercury News had done. They were hiring people from all over the country. They were throwing money at it. There was opportunities to travel nationally. The Dallas Morning News saw itself as the regional paper of the Southwest, like the LA Times or the New York Times of the Southwest. And in a lot of ways that was justified, you know. In some ways it was aspiring beyond their capabilities, but nothing wrong with aspiration or ambition, right? And when I got there and I met the staff and I saw what they were doing with the features section, they were going to be using the feature staff almost like an auxiliary national staff. So those people would be traveling all over the country. I thought, wow, this is a really great job. So now I wanted this job. And I was offered the job, and I took it almost immediately. And I was, initially, it was hard for me to say that I was moving to Texas. I'm a native Californian. I could say Dallas. I could say I was moving to Dallas, but I couldn't say I was moving to Texas. It just seemed like I don't know, a foreign land to me. But when I left 3 years later, I left, you know, with tears streaming down my face on the plane, looking down at the city. I really came to love Texas and Texans. I've lived in 3 states, California, Texas, Virginia, that are very heavy in state identification and personality. And I get that, you know, and I think having grown up in California, I understood that about Texans. And it made me feel very connected to them in that way. And Texas, like California, is a huge state. You know, the people in San Antonio and Austin and Houston and Dallas, they're different. They have different personalities and needs and interests. And so it was an endlessly fascinating place to be a reporter. And we did travel all over the country. And so I felt more like a national reporter than a local reporter. And we were writing very large magazine-style stories at the time. It was, you know, I look back on my 25-year newspaper career and I think, wow, I was living in like the last golden age of 20th century journalism, and I was lucky enough to be part of it. And change was on the way, but we couldn't see it then. And I am so lucky and happy that I did not know the change was coming, because I just enjoyed what it was, right? The staff, the feature staff, was a veteran staff, all experienced reporters, really good writers, really. They really challenged me to learn how to be a better writer. I learned a lot from them, and that's really where I think I became a writer. I think I had my moments in San Jose, but mostly in San Jose I was learning how to be a really good reporter. And then I was able to take those skills and learn how to be a good writer in Dallas. And I was spending a lot of time in the middle of other people's lives when I was in Dallas. So by that I mean, there's a story that is one of my favorites from that time that came out of a phone call that a gentleman named Bill James made to the newspaper. He was a Vietnam vet, a Marine. He had fought at the Battle of Way City, which was one of the Marines' bloodiest battles in their history. And he had read that the Navy was commissioning a battleship for the first time named after a Vietnam battle, and it was going to be the USS Way City. So he thought it would be great to find his old buddies, and they could all go together to the commissioning ceremony, which was going to be in Pascagoula, Mississippi. So he called the newspaper to see if anybody at the newspaper had heard about any Vietnam veterans organizations who were trying to find people to go to the ceremony. Well, we had not, but the person who took the phone call knew that this was a story. And the phone call got transferred to me. I still don't know how, but it did. So next thing I know, I'm in Bill James's living room, and he is pulling out all this memorabilia from Vietnam, his service, and showing me photographs of people. And his living room at that point was just full of phone books. And phone books, they used to be like this thick. Phone books from all over the country. How he got them, I have no idea. But he was looking for all of his friends. He was trying to remember where people had said they were from. And at that point, you could still find people in the phone book. So I realized that Bill James himself was, in his effort to find his friends, was the story. And so I attached myself to him essentially, for the next some weeks and months, and spent a lot of time with him. He would call me with every new discovery or success that he had in finding somebody. And in the end, he put together a pretty good group of guys who had been with him for that battle. And they were all going to meet in Pascagoula. So I went too, and I went with a photographer. And we lived with them. And they had they were staying at the same hotel, and this hotel had like a clubhouse. And they took this clubhouse over and they made it like Vietnam. It was Vietnam in there. Like hour by hour, things started showing up. Dog tags, uniforms, photographs, weapons, medals. And when there weren't events to participate in, because the Navy really went all out to welcome the Marines who had come for this ceremony, they were in the clubhouse. And they were little by little, not just reliving what they had gone through, but purging themselves of it. And so many of them, there's so much attention now to PTSD and mental health. There wasn't then. And a lot of these guys had suffered greatly and carried memories and guilt and regret, things they couldn't get out of their head, But now that they were all together, it was all coming out. And I was like a fly on the wall, and so was the photographer. We spent so much time with them that they forgot we were there, which is the best possible case if you're a reporter or photographer. And I was there for a very moving moment when their commanding officer walked in the door. And all of these guys just like jumped to their feet and stood at attention. Now, what I later found out was that their commanding officer had either been transferred or killed, I don't remember which. And this young guy who'd only been like in his mid-20s was thrown in to be their commanding officer as they were about to go, and they knew it, into a very bloody battle. He didn't know them, and he was having to give orders that was going to send some of them to their deaths or end in them being grievously wounded. And he didn't know how they thought of him. He feared the worst, that maybe they hated him or held him responsible for those who had died. He just didn't know, and he was really hesitant to come and meet with these men when he found out where they were, but he decided to do it. And when he walked in the door and they all jumped to their feet and saluted him, he had tears coming down his face, and he told them how much he had thought of them over the years, how much they meant to him. And afterwards, I took him aside and I asked him, that's when he told me, that why he had been reluctant to walk in the room. So that was a very moving moment. It was a real, we use this word healing now a lot in popular, parlance, but I think that's what really that was for that room full of men. There was another moment when it was late at night, there'd been a lot of drinking, and one of the men became very angry thinking about how the press wrote about Vietnam. And he turned to me, just like physically turned to me, and very angrily started addressing me as a reporter. And one of the other men very quietly said, "Hey man, she was just a kid." And then he kind of collected himself, and remembered. But, there's so much raw emotion in that room. But I just loved those guys. I really did. And after I left the newspaper, the feature staff at that time was going back and following up on big stories that had run. And they asked me to I was already in Washington at the time working for Newhouse Newspapers, but they asked me to get in touch with Bill James to find out, had he kept in contact with all these friends and find out what had happened to them. So it was a great chance for me to reconnect with him. My dad had been in the Marines, and so I felt that connection with these guys too.
Were there other stories that stuck with you from your time in Dallas?
I'll mention two stories. One is a little bit more lighthearted and ended up being a precursor to work that I would do about American history in the future. But I somehow found out, I wish I could remember how, about a dentist in Florida who had discovered a shipwreck of a Civil War troop transport. And it was the St. Johns River. He had this little boat he called the Mud Puppy, and he needed a project for himself. And he decided what he was going to do is he was going to go into the government records and look for a shipwreck that he could try to find in that river. And he knew that there were a lot of shipwrecks in this river. He was specifically interested in the Civil War. And he came across the story of this troop transport that had been, as it was going down the river, was being, was the object of a struggle between Union forces on one side of the river and Confederate forces on the other side. And the Confederate forces prevailed, boarded this troop transport, and sunk it somehow, I think intentionally, if I remember right. Now, the interesting thing about the troop transport ship is that none of the soldiers were on it. They had been sent off to another battle ahead, and the boat was going to follow them. But what was on the boat was all their personal belongings. And they had these boxes that they had their personal belongings in. And so the dentist figured out with maps and the testimony of the inquiry afterwards, approximately where the boat would have gone down. And he and his best friend just diving by themselves in these muddy waters where you couldn't really even see down there. They were just like feeling. They found the ship. And then they started bringing things up. And this was just after Ken Burns' Civil War series had aired. And so the country was Civil War crazy at the time. Shelby Foote had become like a national hero. What they brought up from the St. Johns River looked like it had gone down the day before. The silt in the river had perfectly preserved everything. They brought up swords, uniforms, boots, these boxes of personal belongings. And almost all of the boxes had seashells because these guys were from the Midwest. They'd never seen the ocean. They were all taking seashells home. So I went and spent a few days with the dentist and his friend. They had managed to cobble together groups of professionals, were helping them to conserve and preserve what they were bringing up. So they had a whole laboratory set up where they had things soaking in different solutions, and there was this whole process to help transition them out of the environment they had been in under the river. And I remember the dentist's wife was a little panicked about this entire enterprise. She said, he's spending the kids' college money. She said she wasn't really quite sure how long this obsession, how far it was going to go, and they belonged to the local country club. They took me out for a lovely dinner one night, and it was really interesting to see how this, transformed their lives. So when I got back to Dallas, one of the first people I wanted to talk to was Shelby Foote, to ask him, how important is this find? How significant is it? And he said he thought it was the most significant find of Civil War soldiers, belongings that had ever been made. It was a large collection. It was in impeccable condition, and they had names and records to attach it to. So it was just all there, waiting for somebody to make good use of it. I often wonder what happened to that dentist and even what happened to the collection. I sort of lost sight of what happened to it. There have been only 2 or 3 times in my career where I have felt intimidated about interviewing somebody. And that was one of the times when I picked up the phone to call Shelby Foote. And I found him in the phone book. I knew where he lived. I got the phone book out, looked him up, and there he was. I called him. He answered the phone. And I think I, said something incoherent like, I fell in love with you along with the rest of the country. That was a moment that I had trouble maintaining my objectivity. But he was as charming as could be, that lovely accent of his.
Even though you were based in Dallas, sounds like you did a lot of national projects. How much of that was you finding on your own or being told, go cover this?
At that point in my career, I was mostly finding my own stories. And I remember an editor saying to me that the best reporter is someone you could put in an empty room and they'd walk out with 10 story ideas. And so what he meant by that was you're always thinking, you're always noticing, you're always seeing, even when you don't want to. So what I mean by that is when you're a reporter, it's hard to turn off. And it makes you a little bit apart from other people, which may be a reason why when I'm around newspaper people, I feel most like myself. And I imagine people who are in the military, who've been in combat maybe, feel that. Or maybe medical professionals, like in an emergency room situation. If you belong to a group of people where you're somehow apart from others by necessity, right? Or you're seeing and hearing things that are hard to hear and see, but it's your job to do it. There's a part of you that becomes a little detached. And so I think probably still even to this day, when I'm around newspaper people, I know that we're like kindred spirits, like we've had these similar experiences. So I feel that. But I was, so here's how a story idea can happen. I was in church in Dallas one Sunday, and I thought that was the one place I could go where I would not be thinking like a reporter. And that Sunday, a young man who was introduced to the parish as a deacon stood up, and his name was Mark, Father Mark. And he explained that he was there to figure out if he should become a priest. He had gotten through the whole process, through seminary, etc. He had made the final step, almost like when you're going to get married. And in the Catholic Church, oftentimes they require not marriage counseling, but a meeting with the priest and the couple to talk out any issues they might have unresolved between them, make sure they really do want to get married before they take this step. Well, the same is true if you're going to become a priest. You go through this long process, and at the very end, they want to really make sure that you know what you're doing and that you have a reason for doing it. And somebody asked him, "Why do you want to be a priest?" And he did not have an answer. So they sent him to this very wealthy parish in Dallas. It was on the edge of Highland Park, which is like the Beverly Hills of Dallas. And that's where he was supposed to figure it out. And the 2 senior priests who were there were 2 men he idolized. They had done a lot of work in El Salvador. where at the time, local priests were being killed by the government. It was very difficult and bloody work, and Mark really admired what they had done for the people there. So this was thought to be a safe and nurturing place for him to go. And when he was standing up there that Sunday, I thought, oh, God, I have to write about him. And so I introduced myself to him after the service, and I told him that I'd like to get to know him and I'd be interested in following his journey and to write about it for the Dallas Morning News. And he was completely open to it. He said he was open to a lot of things at that point in his life, and he was trying to figure out who he was and what his mission was, what his job was supposed to be in life. And he welcomed me and a photographer named Beatrice. And together, the three of us spent a lot of the next few months, together. And it was a really interesting development, as often happens in stories. You go in thinking one thing is happening, but something else very different is happening. And in this case, the two priests who he worked with and who he idolized so much became jealous of him and all of the attention that the parish lavished on him, because they really did take to heart to try to help him figure out his way. And it became a very uncomfortable environment for him. But it was a good thing in the end, because he had never really had any hardship in his life. And in experiencing this sort of disappointment and sense of betrayal even, he began to understand that it wasn't about him, it was about what he could do for other people. And that was like the bridge he had not gotten to in his journey to the priesthood. And once he got there and figured that out, then he knew why he wanted to be a priest. And he realized that even people who did good works in the world could let earthly things get to them. And so he decided that he was going to go through with it. And Beatrice and I covered the ordination ceremony, which is quite a beautiful and spectacular ceremony. She actually put a camera in the ceiling, and there's a part of the ceremony where the priest candidate lies, face down at the front of the church that's shaped like a cross, and there's arms outstretched. We had this beautiful photograph from the ceiling of that. And I remember at one point in the ceremony, they recite all the saints' names, and then the refrain is "Pray for us." And so it was a very long ceremony. And I went home that night. That was the last piece of it. And I just felt strongly that I had to finish writing the story. I'd written like 3/4 of it, but I felt like I had to finish writing it that night or it wasn't going to get finished. I don't know why I felt that, but I did. So I was in my condo all night long, throughout the night, writing. And in the morning, the story was done. There's one other story I'd like to talk about, and that's a profile I did of a woman named Cookie Rodriguez. She was, it's hard to say what she was exactly. She was the one person in Dallas who the gangs listened to. And these were gangs of mostly young people. And for whatever reason, they saw her as a mother figure. She was almost like a social worker in a way. She had almost like a rec center, which would be a place where they could come, members of different gangs. And everybody deferred to her. The police, the local police in Dallas, really relied on her to keep the peace with the gangs. And she had a charismatic, very handsome son who worked alongside with her. And she was really, a singular figure in the city. She did managed through the own force of her personality to do something that no one else was capable of doing. Until her own son was gunned down. And initially, this outsized impression that people had of her seemed to be showing itself, in that she seemed very resilient and determined to continue her work. She seemed to be very determined to make his death count in a positive way. And so that was the story that I was setting out to do. That is what I thought the narrative was for the profile I was going to write about her in the aftermath of her son's death. But what I discovered pretty quickly is that she was trying to be for everybody what they thought she was, and she was what she really was a grieving mother. And she completely fell into her grief. And the story became how she pulled herself out of that, to be able to resume her work and to be the person that the gangs needed and that the police needed, a changed, different person, but she managed to resurrect herself. In fact, I think that might have been the headline of the story, the resurrection of Cookie Rodriguez, I think. And it was a real privilege to be an observer of that transformation. And I think, too often in life we look at certain people and we think that they have superhuman qualities of some sort, that they can manage anything. And she was a clear example of that. But as I got to know her, I realized there was a different quality that was actually in action, something that all of us can relate to, because all of us get knocked down in life by something. And how you pull yourself out of it says a lot about who you are and the kind of life you're going to lead. And so she ended up being a role model of a kind she never would have wanted to be or intended to be for these kids, but she showed them, for how difficult they thought their lives were, and many of them had lost friends to gang violence or drugs or what have you. She showed them that she herself could go through something really painful and come out the other end and still want to be able to be a force for good and to help people. So it was a real privilege being alongside for that. And I remember at one point, the photographer and I went with her to the cemetery. She was going to visit her son's grave. And I remember her just sitting down next to the grave and talking to him. It was, she was like the mother to all these kids, right? But the one child she wanted, she lost. So, I think when you have a job like the job that I had at that newspaper, you're a witness to some of the most difficult moments in people's lives sometimes. But the way I try to think about it is they're meaningful, they're difficult, but they're meaningful. And, hopefully what I could do and what the photographer could do is like share those moments with other people, because it's all part of our common humanity. And that's something that I think is so missing from journalism now. There's just not the infrastructure for those kinds of stories. Newspapers don't really have the resources. I used to be set loose for weeks and months to work on stories. That just doesn't happen anymore. Everything's immediate. Everything's a post. And you can not have anything in common with a person, but what you do have in common with them is their humanity. And I think that was one thing that newspapers did do, is that it brought at least made connections between people who had led very different lives, you know. And I think more and more these days, the people we know are the people who are living lives like ours. And we don't have as much understanding about people whose lives are not like ours. And that's really too bad.
What changes did you see happen between the time that you graduated with your journalism degree and by the time you were ready to move on from Dallas?
I think journalism became more professionalized. By that, I mean, when I first arrived in San Jose, a lot of the older reporters who were there, who are my age now or younger, had not gone to college. They'd not been trained as journalists. They learned on the job. And I still think in many ways that was the best way to become a reporter, was to actually learn on the job. There's only so much you can learn in the abstract, which is why I think that the Berkeley program was so helpful to me, because we were actually putting out a newspaper and we were getting real-time instruction and critiques and assistance in that. It wasn't theoretical what we were doing, we were actually doing reporting. So I went from being in this early environment with these mostly men, you know, in their 40s, 50s, 60s, who had not had professional training, but who had occupied this sort of almost romantic kind of environment of newspapers. You know, I think of like His Girl Friday with Cary Grant. There was still some remnants, you know, of that culture. But it quickly became very professionalized. So by the time I left the San Jose Mercury News, the kinds of interns they were looking for, they were looking at Ivy League colleges. So you're going to get a certain perspective on life when you're only bringing in interns from Ivy League colleges, right? And there was much more emphasis on awards and on writing or producing series or writing stories with awards in mind, as opposed to just the value of what is the story. You know, what do you need? What's the value for people in knowing about something? It was becoming more of an industry, I would say.
Did you feel like you worked your way up on the kind of progression you described earlier from cub reporter on up? Where were you in your path when you were at Dallas?
So when I was in Dallas, by the time I left, I was ready for the next thing. I was there for 3 years. And I had the opportunity to meet with an editor, former editor of mine from the San Jose Mercury News, Robert Hodiern, who had gone with his wife, Lisa Shepard, also a reporter at the San Jose Mercury News. She and I covered courts at the same time. She covered civil courts, I covered criminal courts. And they had gone sailing with their toddler son in the Pacific for several years. And they were now back. And he had taken a job as the deputy editor of the Newhouse Newspapers Washington Bureau. And Newhouse Newspapers at the time was the third largest newspaper chain in the country. And he had heard through mutual friends that I was coming to Washington for the first Clinton inauguration. And I was going to be there about a week. And we arranged to get together for lunch at the end of the week. It was a very busy week. For me. I was writing both for the national desk and for the feature section, and it was, you know, working around the clock for that week. It was very exciting, and it was fun for me too, because journalists that I knew from the Mercury News had ended up at different news organizations around the country. We're all in Washington for the inauguration, so it was like an old home week, really, in a way. So at the end of the week, I met Robert for lunch, and when I went to the office to meet with him, he told me that the bureau chief, Deborah Howell, was going to join us. Now, my idea of this lunch is we were going to sit down and share a bottle of wine and catch up. But now I realize, oh, all right, I have to be on best manners. It's a bureau chief, and I wasn't really thinking at that time about moving to or leaving Dallas. If anything, I was probably thinking about how to get back to California. Could I get a job now at the storied Los Angeles Times? And when we had lunch, Deborah asked that dreaded interview question, what do you see yourself doing in 5 years? And then I realized, oh, I think this is a job interview. So it was, in fact, a job interview. Robert had told her about me. They were looking to expand their staff. And now I'm thinking that the prediction I had made in an obit I wrote for myself in college and pasted up on my dorm door. We were all doing this. We all wrote obits to predict how our lives were going to unfold and what careers we would have. And in my obit, I wrote that I had been a Washington, D.C. reporter. And I remember that coming back to me, thinking, oh, this is a chance to do it. So I jumped at it when I was offered the job. And the Bureau for Newhouse Newspapers is the Washington Bureau, so it was about a staff of 30. Most of the reporters were working for individual newspapers, so for the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the New Orleans Times-Picayune, the Newark Star-Ledger, the Oregonian, and they were covering their congressional delegations in the White House. I was hired to be part of a national staff. The national staff only answered to the bureau chief, Deborah Howe. We did not answer to any particular newspaper. But the stories that we wrote were put out on the Newhouse Newspaper's National Wire Service. And all of the newspapers in our chain could use them, including newspapers that subscribed to our news service. So the Seattle Times did, the Dallas Morning News did actually, the Orange County Register did. There were newspapers all around the country in addition to the Newhouse papers that used our stories. So the reach was immense. And we had the freedom to travel around the country and to do the stories that we thought were important, obviously with the approval of the bureau chief, but we had a lot of freedom. I mean, I think about it now, I was rarely in the office. I was always out somewhere. And initially, when I joined the bureau, the beat I had was gender and sexuality, which in 1993 was, let's just say I had to constantly explain to people what it meant. It's not like now where gender and sexuality is a part of everyday conversation. It just was not in 1993. So I interpret it very broadly. So I wrote a lot about the politics of breast cancer, which was a real burgeoning thing at the time. I wrote about women being elected to the House and Senate. There still at that time weren't very many women in either. I wrote about AIDS, still a very large issue in 1993, the politics of AIDS. And I started covering the new First Lady, Hillary Rodham Clinton. And it was through covering Hillary Clinton that I ended up heading in a more traditional Washington direction. And I think at first my editors sort of indulged my interest in the First Lady. I think they, like a lot of people at the time, really didn't take a First Lady very seriously. But she soon proved herself to be someone that you had to cover seriously. She was a significant part of that administration. And in writing about her, I ended up writing about other First Ladies to try to understand the role that she had taken on. And in writing about other First Ladies, I found myself more and more heading in the direction of women's history. And as I headed in the direction of women's history, then I headed in the direction of just American history in general. So I transformed my coverage area to be American history. And I think really some of the roots in that was some of my earliest reporting in San Jose when in trying to understand my new city that I was living in. I spent a lot of time with people who knew the history of San Jose and of the Santa Clara Valley to try to understand this part of California that I really knew very little about when I arrived. And one of the people I met on that journey was the city historian, Clyde Arbuckle. And he was very interesting to me because his brother was Fatty Arbuckle, who had been an early Hollywood star and had figured in a large Hollywood sex scandal of the time. But Clyde Arbuckle he was just this lovely man who was probably deep into his 60s, if not already early 70s at the time I met him in the mid 80s. And he looked a little bit like a park ranger, you know. He had that kind of, it's kind of like almost a safari helmet and these like beige clothes, I remember, a shirt and pants. And he took me on one occasion around the largest and oldest cemetery in San Jose. Members of the Donner Party are there. A lot of, you know, sort of Old West figures are buried there. I remember that there was a sheriff and an outlaw buried next to each other. They died in a gunfight. They killed each other, and they're buried next to each other. I remember another set of graves. There was 5 slabs in the ground right next to each other, and there were a couple of words on the bottom of each tombstone that when you read it all together said, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." And I remember asking him, what happened to these people? And what had happened at about the turn of the century, from 19th to 20th, was that this family with a farmhouse had been the victims of what we would now call a domestic crime. Their daughter's husband killed them all, the parents, the farmhand, the wife, and left only his baby on the bed alive next to his dead wife. Hopped on his horse and literally headed for the hills. And there was a posse sent after him, but he was never found. So these poor people were buried next to each other with this biblical saying on the bottom of the tombs. So, you know, that began in a lot of ways my fascination with cemeteries as a source of stories and history. And so when I'm in Washington now and I'm realizing what I'm really doing is creating this new beat focused on American history and trying to understand how the past and present interact, and how the past informs the present. So I created this American history beat, and that in itself transformed again when September 11th happened. I was home getting ready for the workday, and I always used to listen to the oldies radio station, music from the 60s and 70s. I was dealing with news all day long, so I did not put the news on in the morning, either on the television or the radio. And the disc jockey interrupted the music to say that something strange had happened. A plane had hit one of the World Trade Center towers. And he didn't know any more than that, but he would break in again when there was more news. Well, even though it was in New York, I knew I had to hustle into the office. Something was happening and I needed to get to the office. So already, and I realized the power of television because I didn't understand what was happening since I didn't have the television on and there weren't smartphones then. I walked out my door and a series of strange events were unfolding. One, the bus came, but people were asking the driver if he thought the metro was working. Someone on the bus saw me take out my little flip phone. I was going to call my mother because whenever something big happened, she would always, you know, even if it was many states away, want to know that I was fine. So I thought I would just call and let her know this strange thing had happened in New York. She knew as a reporter I was liable to be sent anywhere, and that had happened on many occasions. I think it was very difficult for both my parents during the earthquake, for example, because there was so little communication during those days. And so that's why, my instinct was to call her. But someone on the bus told me my phone wouldn't work. I couldn't understand why he would say that. And we got to the metro station, and someone made an announcement that the trains were running, but we would be stopped at Pentagon City. And I thought, well, why is that? And we didn't get as far as Pentagon City. We got to National Airport, still then called National Airport, and we were all told to get off of the train. And that's when I saw the Pentagon on fire. There was this huge, billowing black cloud over it. And I was trying to understand what was happening. None of those things connected for me. I didn't understand. And then another announcement was made. We were get back on the train. We were not stopping at Pentagon City. We were going straight through. So by the time I got off at Farragut North, the White House had just been evacuated, and people were running and crying in the streets. Women were running barefoot, and I later found out that as they were evacuating the White House, they were being told to leave behind their high heels, just jump out of them and start running. And there was a sea of people trying to get down Connecticut Avenue, and I was going against that sea of people trying to get to my office. So that day put me on a new path, because I started to realize in conversations with my editors that we had entered some new world. And I thought, in the way that a reporter might have covered the World War II era, if someone had said, okay, we're now in the World War II era, that I wanted to try to capture what was happening. And the person who set me really on that path more than anybody was David Kennedy, the historian. He had written a Pulitzer Prize winning 2-volume set, I think it was, on the Great Depression and World War II. And everybody that day was already saying, oh, this is another Pearl Harbor. And I wanted to ask him, was it? As it happened, he was vacationing off an island off in the Pacific Northwest. I tracked him down, and he only had a radio. And so he was just hungry for information. He wanted to know everything that I knew at that point. So I was downloading to him, what I could. And then I asked him the question. I said, is this Pearl Harbor? And he said, no, it's not. He said, on December 7th, 1941, we were attacked by a nation state. This is not Pearl Harbor. This is a terrorist organization, and everything will follow from that. And he turned out to be exactly right. He was a very good source of mine at that point. And I am glad that I had him to call, because he wasn't one of the few voices of reason on that day when people were kind of reacting out of emotion and knee-jerk reactions to things. So as it became clear that there would be some sort of military response, clearly it became clear we would go after Osama bin Laden. Iraq started to come into focus. So in this period, I constructed a new beat called The American Identity. And the idea was to try to capture whatever new world this was that we were in. But it was also still informed by our past. So that was how I concluded my newspaper career. And as part of that, I started, in the way that I'd written about Hillary Clinton and the kind of first lady she was, I started writing about the presidency of George W. Bush. I wasn't interested in the day in and day out White House coverage. Plenty of other reporters were doing that. I wanted to write about his presidency. I wanted to look at how he was conducting himself as president, and what about that could inform all these other larger conversations we were having about what was happening to us as a country, what our response to terrorism meant, what it meant in terms of how we conducted ourselves as a government. And so in 2 different periods, I spent a lot of time at the White House. I spent a lot of time at the White House when the Clintons were in office. I spent a lot of time at the White House when George W. Bush was in office. And I never took for granted a single time that I walked through those gates. It was a real privilege to be able to be there. And I would often think of my paternal grandfather, Luis Rios, who had a Frame magazine photograph of FDR in his, I suppose you'd call it a workshop, one of those. It was like a shed, really, but it's where all his tools were, his fishing boat was, his truck was, and we were only allowed to go in, the grandchildren, if he was with us. And he had this wooden frame magazine photo above the door. And, during the Depression, the family had been very poor. And his father had died when I think he was 16, and he had been the man of the family, and he had helped the family survive the Depression. And he idolized FDR because of all the things that he felt that he had done for working people like himself. So I would think about my grandfather walking through the shed of door, and he'd always say, "Hello, Mr. Roosevelt. Good morning, Mr. Roosevelt. Good afternoon, Mr. Roosevelt." And I think about him that I was actually in the White House where Mr. Roosevelt was. And so, you know, it was a real privilege for me to be there. And when I left Newhouse Newspapers, I had been at that time a newspaper reporter for 25 years. And so you asked earlier about how how newspapering had changed in the time that I was in it. So by 2006, the internet had upended the business model for newspapers. Advertising had migrated to the internet. So if you were in Dallas, say, and you were a tire manufacturer, you no longer were wedded to the idea of running a full-page ad in the Dallas Morning News for your tire sale. You could put it on the internet, and it could reach people all over the country. And that destroyed the financial model for newspapers. And newspapers started collapsing. The bureaus started collapsing in Washington. And I got caught up in that. It's one of those changes in technology. You know, it's like, it wasn't a good thing to be a blacksmith when people started moving from horses to cars. It was a change like that. And so my the Newhouses who owned Newhouse Newspapers offered the national staff reporters, there were 12 of us at the time, buyouts. And the idea is they'd give you, you know, a nice chunk of money, and you would leave and not sue them. And most of the people at that time were of an age where you could have sued for age discrimination, but you had to sign, you know, paperwork saying that you would not sue them. And they would give you this money, and you would part ways. And that bureau closed right after the 2008 election. So everybody in that bureau lost their job. So I was lucky that I was offered a buyout, and I was lucky that I had the good sense to take it, because the people who held on, you know, were left with no money and no job in the end. So I was confronted with, what do I do? For the first time since I was 22 years old, I didn't know what I was going to do. And I started having conversations, I called them informational interviews, with people who I respected to help me think it out. And one of the people I had a conversation with was the then director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, Mark Pachter. And for as busy as a man as he was, he not only said, "Sure, come on over, let's talk." We sat in his office for an hour and just brainstormed. And he helped me probably more than anybody to understand that I had skills that could translate to other things. And for the first time, I began to see that there was another future in front of me. I was already in my 40s. It was a very frightening time for me to think about remaking myself, you know. And somewhere in this process, one of my colleagues in the Newhouse Bureau came across a online posting for a job offered by C-SPAN. They were looking for a history producer. And she sent it to me. I had helped her get her job, and she very kindly tried to return the favor. She sent it to me, and she said, "You should apply for this." And I had never thought about being in television. I'd had a chance when I was in my 20s. The local San Francisco affiliate had a reporter in San Jose covering basically the South Bay area, but he and I got to know each other covering courts. His name was Rigo Chacon. and he thought he was a real star there, and he thought I'd be great on TV. I wasn't interested in following up being a television reporter, although it would have been exciting being a television reporter in San Francisco, certainly. But I thought I would spend all my time covering fires. And I thought I was beyond that as a reporter. And it was very flattering, but I didn't give much thought to it. And when I did go to Dallas, the first week I was there, Rigo had a beautiful bouquet of flowers delivered to me to wish me luck in my new job. I always really thought the world of him. So when I learned about this job at C-SPAN, I really didn't know what it entailed. I felt, at the age I was then, that I was too old to do anything on camera. I didn't think I was probably the demographic they were looking for. It wasn't like I had been in my 20s when Rigo brought up the idea. But I was interested in the fact that C-SPAN was trying to broaden its American history coverage. And C-SPAN had, at that point, already produced a documentary on the U.S. Capitol. I look back on it now, it's a very primitive attempt, but an honest one. And at the time that they were looking for a, quote, history producer, I'm not even really quite sure they knew what that meant yet, but they were embarking on a new live series out of the then 12 presidential libraries. And they needed a producer to help work on that project. I was hired after about a 6-month back and forth. It seemed endless to me because, of course, the money that I had from the buyout was going to cover me for about a year, but I needed a job. And I had, in the meantime, taken a teaching job at the University of Maryland for the fall semester of 2006, teaching journalism ethics. But I might as well have been paying them. I think I was paid $5,000 for the semester, and it was a lot of work. But as it turned out, I had that job, and then I got the C-SPAN job in early October of 2006. So then I was doing 2 jobs I'd never done in my life at the same time. It was a very stressful semester for me. And the idea behind the Presidential Library Series is that we would go to each library and we would try to make use of what their holdings were to highlight them. So we were going to pull out their film footage, much of which had not been seen by the public ever. There's only so many ways to use film footage in museum exhibits, and then much of it just sits in the archive somewhere. Their photographs, their documents, and we were going to have guests and a host in the studio. Brian Lamb, the founder of C-SPAN, was going to be the host in the studio, and he was going to be, I think in almost all cases, talking with Richard Norton Smith, the historian. And my job as a producer was to arrange for everything that was going to happen on site at the library. So that meant figuring out who were going to be the on-camera guests, what artifacts, documents, and even film footage we were going to use. I was responsible for producing in advance little video packages and taking advantage of some of that film footage. I was responsible for helping the archivists select documents that we could highlight during the show. I was responsible for figuring out what the set was. And I was working with a crew chief who was managing the technical side. So that would be the technicians, the camera crew, the audio guy, and we were transmitting from a satellite truck at each location. So that's a lot of work, right? I had never done any of this work before, and now I'm responsible for 5 of the 12 libraries for the live shows. So it was like being thrown into the deep end of the pool. It reminded me to some degree of what it had been like to being a new reporter when I was still trying to figure out what the job was. And C-SPAN is not an organization that does a lot of hand-holding. You either do it or you don't. And I learned a lot of things the hard way. And it was a very humbling experience in many ways. I think I probably was in tears more times my first year at C-SPAN than I ever was in my entire career. But the frustration was really trying to figure out the transition from telling stories with words, which is what I knew how to do, to telling stories, through video. And I could interview somebody. Say, I could go to the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library. I could interview their archivist for several hours and take the best of what he said and make it into an interesting story. It was a much different thing to determine, could this person be on camera comfortably, A. B, the list of questions that I would draft for the host to ask this person. Would the host follow the list? Would the archivist answer those questions? Would the archivist be too nervous to sort of follow the stage directions that we had agreed upon in advance? There was just so many elements that now went into telling the story that I wanted to tell. And I was often thwarted, and I just found that that was just a function of being a producer. You do the best that you can. You set up the situation as best as you can. You try to figure out the best person on camera that you can. You try to develop the best questions that you can. And then when the camera starts rolling, it's an organic process. And what happens, happens. And very quickly, I started repeating a saying that I was hearing my own boss, who was the executive producer of this series, Mark Farkas, say. He'd say, well, that's live TV for you. And so once I learned how to roll with that, I was a little bit more at ease with my job, but the first year or two was a real challenge.
So this was a big jump for not only the field, but a big jump fully into American history. Had you had other instances in your career where you'd really been able to focus on American history?
Well, when I was at Newhouse Newspapers and I had the American History beat and then the American Identity beat, I felt immersed in that world, and I quickly developed a network of my own. So whereas some of my colleagues their main sources or best contacts were in congressional offices, say, or in the agencies, the government agencies, or at the White House or the Pentagon, State Department, I was getting to know the directors of the different Smithsonian museums, the chief historian for the National Park Service, the Librarian of Congress. I was meeting people who, were the archivists behind the scenes. They were like the equivalent of covering cops and figuring out who were the clerks who knew, what the biggest cases were coming in and who to talk to. And so I was learning a community in Washington that I hadn't known before. And I developed over a series of years some really good relationships with these people. And I kind of think about it sometimes. I still marvel at it a little bit. If I'm having a conversation with, say, the Smithsonian Secretary or the Librarian of Congress or the Chief Historian for the National Park Service. And I think, that's pretty lucky, really, to have these people be part of my day-to-day world. And sometimes there's so much a part of my day-to-day world that I forget about how special that is. But when I got to C-SPAN and I was assigned to first the Presidential Library Series, and then for the bicentennial of Abraham Lincoln's birth, I was assigned to coordinate our coverage, our year-long coverage of those commemorations. And then after that, I was one of three people who were assigned to formed the first three legs of what became American History TV at C-SPAN. So the first three legs were general history event coverage. So say an author talking about a new book on Ulysses S. Grant, say, at a local bookstore here in town. Or say there's going to be a ceremony at the Lincoln Memorial. So typical C-SPAN event coverage. Something is happening, someone's speaking, someone's doing something, and we are just taping it from A to Z. And then a second leg, which I was responsible for, was oral histories. And I was working with organizations around the country to bring in their videotaped oral history projects. So I worked with the National World War II Museum, NASA, Densho, the Japanese-American effort to bring in oral histories with people who'd been interned during Second World War in the internment camps. I worked with the Dole Institute of Politics. I worked with the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and their oral history project. I worked with the Organization of Women Lawyers, who had done oral histories with women who were, you know, in the 60s and 70s, some of the earliest women to really, you know, get beyond the glass ceiling and to really, you know, have significant careers in the law. Eventually, this very primitive coverage became an entire weekend, 48 hours of coverage of American history. And we had special series on the Civil War, on the presidency, a program called Lectures in History, where we taped lectures with university professors around and college professors around the country on different topics. We had a program called Real America, where we highlighted government footage. A lot of it, you know, we might describe as propaganda footage made by the government over the years, but also, you know, interesting films documenting, say, the president's, a particular president's, you know, trip, like a JFK to Berlin, or you know, LBJ, A Week in the Life of LBJ. And the team of people that developed, there's a small team of people working on that coverage. And I worked on that starting in about 2010, I think. It's now 2024. And I am, as of this moment, still a producer for American History TV. So sort of, in a way, not really dictated by me in a conscious way. I ended up spending now, 18 years as a television producer. And it's astonishing to me that I am creeping up on the 25 years that I spent as a newspaper reporter. And so I've had these two different lives, and I mentioned earlier that newspaper people, where I felt so at home with them. Well, the people that I've met at C-SPAN are, you know, much alike. You know, there's a mission there to provide nonpartisan information for your average American, to help them make up their own mind about what they think about whatever, politics, history, nonfiction books. And that mission really binds the people who work at C-SPAN because they believe in it. They wouldn't be doing that job if they didn't believe in it. And in the environment that we're in now, it's a very rare thing. And it wasn't, I don't know that I was all that conscious of really dedicating like the second half of my career to that idea, but that's what happened.
Was it different going from newspapers where you have a byline and you have credit and you're able to craft a story to what you do now as a television producer?
In a word, yes. As a reporter, I was often really frustrated that people could not hear or see what I was hearing or seeing. And I tried so hard as a writer to convey a sense of that. And But on the other hand, when I got to C-SPAN and I had the video and I had the audio, I also realized I didn't have control. I couldn't shape it the way I wanted to. I could steer it in a particular direction, but whoever was doing the talking, whether it was our host, what we call an anchor, a host, or the guest, they were just going to take it where they were going to take it. I could only tee it up for them so much. And sometimes it turned out the way I hoped, and sometimes it didn't. And but it was such a rich experience to be able to see and hear things. And I mean, I think about one trip to the National Archives. We were looking at a document signed by Hitler that had been taken at the end of the war. I want to say, I think by patent. And it somehow ended up in the holdings of the Huntington Library in California. And this was a particularly important document, and the National Archives thought it should be in their collection. And after much negotiation, they did get it back. And I went with the camera crew, and we met with the archivist who had gone to California and supervised the handing over of this document and had brought it back personally to the National Archives. And he had it out on a table. And there's, to see Hitler's signature was a very chilling experience. And that would be it'd be really hard to convey in words. But that was something that we could capture on video, and viewers could see it for themselves. And I think the thing about C-SPAN is that we can take people places they might like to go, but maybe they don't come to Washington, or maybe those places are closed off to them. We recently did an on-camera tour at the State Department's diplomatic reception rooms. The public can go, but you have to reserve tickets. It's like at the White House, you have to go through your congressional office. Same thing with the FBI headquarters museum, where we just did a tour. It's a lot of effort. But because we were there, not only can you be sitting in your living room and watching it on television, you can pull it up on your smartphone and watch the video. So we're like a conduit. We can take people places that they're interested in, but might be hard to get to physically. And that is a real public service, I think.
It sounds like going some of those special places have been like a highlight. Are there other highlights that you've had in your career that we haven't touched on?
There's two things I'd like to bring up before we conclude. And when I was working with Newhouse Newspapers, we had a young woman in our office as an intern. She was a photographer. And she was, I think, a senior in college at the time. And she had been at a study abroad program in Nairobi, Kenya. And while there, she had taken a series of photographs of a young girl who was undergoing what is sort of officially called female genital mutilation, and very complicated cultural custom that women's rights activists have been trying to eradicate, because it's physically altering a young girl's body in the name of hygiene and purity and marriageability, but essentially disfiguring her. And it's so embedded in some cultures. It's really a difficult thing to eradicate even now. So this intern had become interested in a young woman who was preparing to go through this process. And there's all these ceremonial aspects to it. So she documented this. It's a very painful series of photographs. But they not only captured the actual procedure, cutting ceremony, but all the cultural aspects around it. And for her series of photographs, she was awarded a Pulitzer Prize. If I remember right, I think she was the youngest person to be awarded a Pulitzer Prize in photography at the age of 22. And she had also, while in Nairobi, been taking photographs of street children. And she realized that many of them were engaging in prostitution, boys and girls, very young, like 10 to 17, you know. And my editors saw some of these photographs, and they decided that this too was a story, and they wanted to send her back to flesh the story out. And they asked me to go with her, since I was at that time still covering the gender and sexuality beat. And the reason these children had been driven to prostitution is because many of them were AIDS orphans. Many of them were orphaned by different wars in, you know, adjoining countries. And a lot of these children were coming from very poor villages out in the countryside. There was no future there. There was no jobs. There was no education. They'd make their way to Nairobi. And Nairobi was, in 1996, when we went there, was a very complicated city, I would say. There were so many children living on the street, and huge slums, terrible, terrible slums, like the size of small towns. And yet you also had the tourists coming for the safaris, and you'd see them go by in these very fancy, you know, Suburbans and SUVs and so forth in their safari gear. And it was also, we later found out, a breeding ground for terrorists. So at the time we were there, later found out Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda was already plotting to bomb the U.S. Embassy, which they did a few years later, 2 or 3 years later. And so it was a very complicated place to be. We went for 2 weeks, and we were on the street with a particular group of girls who we were introduced to by nuns who ran a social service organization. They were trying to work with these children and provide them some sort of refuge and health care and education, and try to wean them off the streets. But it was very difficult because there wasn't really, I mean, where were they going to go? You know, who was going to take care of them? They were just children. So they did what they could. And there was a particular group of girls, and very often there would be like groups of the children who would band together for protection, and there'd be a leader. So in this case, there was a leader, and she was open to the idea. You know, it was explained to her who we were, what we were doing, and that we wanted to know about their lives. And it was also explained to them that there wasn't anything that we could do directly to help them. We couldn't get them food, we couldn't pay for a taxi ride somewhere, we weren't going to take them back to America. And that was something that did come up later. And so the leader seemed to understand these conditions, and so we spent 2 weeks with them. And it was a really very, I was surprised at how quickly the photographer and I got used to the everyday violence of being in that environment, and that helped us understand what the girls went through every day. And we would be witnesses to them getting in the car with some man they called it to go for the road, you know, to get in the car to go for the road. And they'd be gone for a short time, and then they'd come back with a few coins in their hand, and they'd buy oatmeal, say. It was, you know, very little money, but it was what they survived on. And so in documenting the story, again, you know, you're a witness to people's lives, right? And I remember this one afternoon that they had gone to wash their clothes. There was a place that had running water, and they would take their clothes and rinse them out and then hang them on the adjoining concrete walls and so forth. And it was right off of a city sidewalk, and as people who clearly had jobs and homes were walking by, they would be staring at them. And I remember the youngest of the girls, who was about 11, who had hardly spoke. She just started screaming at them. Do not stare at us. We are not statues. We are human beings. And that, for me, like encapsulated that entire story. You know, they were the people who are easy to look away from, who you don't want to look too closely at, and you know, largely because people don't know what to do. They don't know how to help. And there were all these international organizations at that point that were trying to help. But when you like get on the day-to-day level with children who are just trying to survive every day, like what are they going to eat that day? Where are they going to sleep that day? You just saw how monumental the problem was. So as time went on, we became targets ourselves on the street because Stephanie's cameras, she had all these cameras around her neck. And at one point, one of the girls told us that there was a gang of boys who were planning to rob us that night. So they warned us, and we actually ended up taking shelter in a church for a while. And it was such a different environment for us, like day to day, being surrounded by this violence and crime and so forth and heartache, that when we came back to Washington, I couldn't stand how clean the streets were. It made me cry, you know, and I had 2 weeks to write the story. And then I was being sent to San Diego for the Republican National Convention in 1996. Bob Dole was the nominee. I mean, it was just so hard to reconcile everything that was happening at the same time. And right before we left, one of the girls was asking us to, you know, could she come back with us? And I remember one of the nuns telling us that, you know, if those girls lived past 20, they'd be lucky. And that was in 1996. I often wonder, you know, what happened to them. But I did find out later that the story that Stephanie and I worked on, that it was circulated at the highest international levels, I think including at the UN. And that, you know, the only thing I could take some solace in was that I think the story got in front of the eyes of people who might be able to make a difference, and somehow. What tangibly came out of that, I don't know. But lots of times, you know, you do a story, or, you know, even with C-SPAN, you have an interview with somebody, you don't know how that works in the world, you don't know how it impacts somebody. Maybe it encourages somebody to do something for the good. You can only hope so, but you don't know.
So we've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything else that we haven't touched on, either when you were working for newspapers or for C-SPAN, that
I would like to tell one story about how things sometimes connect in life. So I mentioned earlier when I was talking about September 11th that the historian I called that day, David Kennedy, was at Stanford University, very well-regarded historian of World War II. I later had a media fellowship at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and it's a lovely opportunity to think and write, and everybody designs their own program of study. I mean, you can be very productive, or you could just, you know, sit on Stanford campus for a week. They don't have any requirements of you. It's just an opportunity to break away from your day-to-day job, give you a chance to think, I suppose, mostly. But I had an idea to make all kinds of appointments with different professors I wanted to meet and talk to, and to hear about their work, you know, looking for ways to think about my own work and coverage. And one of the people I really wanted to talk to was David Kennedy. I wanted to hear his thoughts on where he thought we were in sort of our journey as a country, based on his own work on the Depression and World War II. And I loved his office. I walked into his office. It was kind of a small cubby hole. I mean, he was a very prominent professor, and he had this tiny little office. But it was like wall-to-wall books. And I couldn't stop looking at the books. They were just so beautiful. And some of them very old, obviously. And I brought with me a series of stories that I had written for Newhouse newspapers called We the People. And it's a pretty simple idea. Go to the National Archives, choose a selection of artifacts, write a 500-word story about that artifact, publish it with like one photograph of the artifact. The holdings of the National Archives are immense, right? But this was a way just to give people a glimpse into what is in there and the kinds of stories that they tell. And my editors were so pleased with how the project ended up. We did it over a period of a year, that they submitted the project for a Pulitzer Prize. And that was I felt really very honored by that, because it's a process to submit something for a Pulitzer Prize, and organizations take it seriously. It's not something you do on a whim. And they made a very serious effort at it. Somewhere in that unfolding of events, David Kennedy, who sat on the Pulitzer board, recommended to his colleagues that I be invited to be a juror for the next round of Pulitzer Prize judging. And I received a phone call sitting at my desk from the administrator of the Pulitzer Prizes, asking me if I would consent to being a juror for the next round of judging. And I said, well, of course, but why me? Why are you calling me? And he told me that David Kennedy had recommended me. I was so startled, surprised, and I called him to thank him, but I asked again. I said, I guess I don't really quite understand why. And it turned out that little series that I had done, the little We the People series, he called them gems, which was, I thought, lovely language, but he said it was my writing that he thought that I could bring something to the judging that maybe, that was maybe needed, and that they didn't have as much as they should. And again, I was just really very flattered by that, but more than flattered, it was just nice recognition, because in my career, I was approached by the Washington Post. It was not a job at the time that I felt like I wanted to take. And when you're young, you think everything's possible, right? And I thought, oh, well, I'll do that later. Well, there was no later. That was my opportunity to work at the Washington Post. I didn't take it. I had other opportunities along in my career that I did not take. The places I ended up working were places that had a sense of mission. In some cases I fell into it, in other places I realized it. So when I arrived at the San Jose Mercury News, I didn't quite understand early on what I was in the middle of, but I came to realize how lucky I was to be at that newspaper at that time. And but it was the San Jose Mercury News. It wasn't the New York Times, it wasn't the Wall Street Journal, it wasn't the Washington Post. And the Dallas Morning News, for as well as it thought of itself in the Southwest, it wasn't any of those papers either. Now, both of those papers, at the times I was at them, both ranked among the top 10 newspapers in the country. But still, most people haven't heard of the San Jose Mercury News, probably more people the Dallas Morning News. And the Newhouse newspapers, it was a very large newspaper chain. I mean, there were two brothers. One brother got the newspapers, the other brother got the magazine empire, Cy Newhouse. I think billionaires. And in newspaper circles, people respected the chain and the bureau and the national staff. But it's not an organization like your average person knows much about. So I felt like I was always sort of flying under the radar professionally, and I did not make the choices or decisions to fly above that. So being named a Pulitzer judge was recognition of the work that I had done, that I had made it, in my mind.